Limitations of GDP. You've already learned what GDP is. It's a measure of the value of the output of goods and services in a nation in a year. We tend to use GDP to describe how well or how badly an economy is doing and how rich or how poor the people of a country are. Well, there are some things that GDP is really good at. However, there are some things that GDP just does not take into account, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. Let's start by reviewing what GDP does include, what it does measure. On the left of the screen here, we have things that are definitely included in GDP, and these include the value of the output of the different sectors of a nation's economy. The first two images here, a farmer spraying chemicals over his crops and a giant mine, represent the primary sector. That's the primary sector of a nation's economy. Of course, the primary sector includes all things that are extracted from the earth or the sea. The next image of a modern factory and assembly line producing cars represents the secondary sector, the manufacturing sector. GDP does include all goods produced by the secondary sector of an economy. The manufacture of goods and services requires, of course, goods that were produced in the primary sector. Finally, we've got an image of a modern office space, a bunch of people working at their desks. This represents the service sector, or sometimes called the tertiary sector. GDP includes the value of all the goods and services produced in these three sectors of a nation's economy. There are two other ways of measuring GDP that you've already learned about as well. You've got the income approach, which adds up the total wages, the interest, the rents, and the profits of all the households in a nation in a year. And you've got the expenditure approach, which adds up the money spent by households, by the government, by businesses, and by foreigners on a nation's goods and services in a year. These are the things that GDP includes. This is all GDP is. It's the value of the stuff produced in a country in a year. Now, the problem is people tend to talk about GDP like it is the most important measure of well-being in society. But there are a lot of things that GDP does not include. Let's talk about those now. GDP does not include the negatives that sometimes result from the production of goods and services, what we could call economic bads, things like inequality. This first image here represents income inequality. We can see a very destitute slum surrounded by modern high-rise buildings in which people with high-paying jobs work in nice offices and have nice apartments. So the degree of income inequality resulting from the production of goods and services is simply not included in GDP. So when we say a country's GDP is growing, that doesn't mean that everybody in the country is richer. It could mean that a very small number of people at the top are getting richer while everybody else in society's income stays the same. GDP would still increase even if the vast majority of society was not getting richer. Another thing that GDP does not include is negative externalities of production, or more simply, the pollution that results from the production of goods and services. These two negative results of the production of goods and services could be called bads. An increase in GDP does not tell you whether society is more or less equal or whether the environment is more or less polluted than it was before. These are two things that GDP is particularly not good at measuring. Now, the next column over here represents another shortcoming of GDP, a limitation of GDP. Here we've got a man mowing his own lawn. This guy's doing what we could call home labor. He's working on his own yard. He may go and build a deck in his backyard after this. The value of the service that he's providing for himself, or the production of goods for himself, is not included in GDP. Now, does this make him better off and his family better off? It sure does, but it's not measured towards GDP. So work that people do around the home, and this includes things like child rearing, mothers or fathers that stay home to take care of the children, their decision to do that actually makes the country's GDP smaller. Does it make the country worse off? Absolutely not. Society needs people to stay home and take care of their children. However, it's not recorded in GDP. The next image here represents volunteer work. We've got students volunteering, cleaning up a neighborhood. This is not going to be counted towards GDP. These people are not formally employed. They're not being paid for their work. However, what they're doing is very good and valuable for society, but it's simply not recorded in the country's GDP. Over on the right, we've got a couple more images here. We've got a babysitter taking care of a child. She's doing what's called informal labor. Informal labor. Of course, you've probably babysat before, but you probably didn't report the income that you earned to the government. Therefore, according to the GDP figures, the service that you provided when babysitting is simply not recorded towards national income. However, it's a very valuable service, and it's just simply not recorded. So informal labor or informal transactions, so informal markets, sometimes called black markets, are not measured in GDP. In this case, we've got people who have pulled their truck up to the side of the road and they're selling their fruits and vegetables on the side of the road. Chances are they're not reporting the income they earn to the government. So as far as the country's GDP is concerned, these types of transactions never happened. So in this video, we reviewed what GDP measures. We talked about what GDP is good at. It's good at measuring the value of the output of the primary sector, the secondary sector, and the service sector in an economy. But it does not include a lot of things that really impact the well-being of society. It doesn't account for the level of income inequality. It doesn't subtract the negative pollution costs imposed on society when goods and services are produced. It doesn't measure the value of home labor, like raising children and people mowing their own lawn. It doesn't measure the value of volunteer work. And there's all sorts of informal or non-market transactions